So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sheryl Cababa. I'm actually the Chief Strategy Officer at Substantial, which is a design and development consultancy primarily based in Seattle. And I run an equity-centered design practice. And I'm also a design educator. I work at University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering program. Okay, so I'm someone whose career has been fundamentally impacted by the framework that you see here. This is the design thinking framework. It first came out of the D School at Stanford University. And I'm pretty sure most people in this room are familiar with this 5-part process and in terms of using it in your day-to-day work. So there's 5 steps. It starts with empathize on the left. Mina talked quite a bit about that's where you conduct much of your design research. It's followed by define, so synthesizing those findings and applying them. And then ideate, which is coming up with a bunch of ideas that will solve the problem that you defined in the previous phase. And then it ends with prototype and test, which is creating prototypes of the most promising ideas and testing them with end users. And usually, design thinking process is also described as human-centered design. And oftentimes, it's manifested as the user-centered design process. Especially if you work in digital technology, those are who you're typically thinking about. But lately, I really like this cartoon. I include it in a lot of my talks. And it's basically people sitting in a cave and saying, yes, the planet got destroyed. But for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So as a design educator, I get asked a lot about, how do I bring meaning into my work? Am I going to have to kind of make trade-offs in my job to be doing things that I don't want to be doing? And also, I think there's some, there's some quiet despair about this idea of designing specifically for just end users who are using a product when all of this stuff is swirling around it. Maybe you don't agree with the business model. Maybe you think, your corporate bosses are money-grubbing overlords or something. And you're oh, I'm in my lane. I'm in my little lane as a designer. I'm designing screens and buttons and things like that. Can I actually kind of do something? How do I kind of address this tension? Yeah, and I would describe it as this is something many of us are feeling, that there's a narrow focus on users. And it's just the user-centered design process seems like it's falling short of some of the problems that we're thinking about more broadly. I think there's 3 key things about this. The user-centered design process does not acknowledge nor address potential harm. So there's a designer, Azer Raskin. Some of you might be familiar with him. He's often credited or maybe blamed for infinite scroll. When you're scrolling through Instagram and it's feeding you kind of randomized items, and then before you know it, you're haha, I've been doing this for 90 minutes. I didn't realize. Sorry, I've switched over to TikTok, and you are literally on there for 90 minutes before, and you're what did I just watch? I don't even know. And he has said, one of my lessons from infinite scroll is that optimizing something for ease of use does not mean best for the user or humanity. We talk a lot in our industry about designing for delight, but that does not necessarily lead to good outcomes more broadly. Okay, a user-centered approach limits the potential impact of design. So rather than using our empathy-driven practice or our creativity to apply to bigger issues, we end up applying our skills to things like infinite scroll, and also kind of underneath that, maintaining the status quo, kind of maintaining the power that exists in the system, that exists within these large companies, that exists within those who are kind of the decision makers. And there's this we end up sitting with this discomfort that ultimately the impact of what we're doing isn't that great. And then lastly, a user-centered process does not inherently take into account systemic forces. I oftentimes refer to, there's a series of Medium articles written by this designer, Chris Zalawa, called Stop Designing for Africa. And he writes about, for example, the one laptop per child initiative of like the early 2000s. It gained a lot of hype and whatnot. And he said that one reason, there were a bunch of reasons why this initiative failed. But one reason is that the designers and distributors did not understand the context of ownership. He said, the EXO laptop was rejected by adults in African economies because it focused on empowering one child as opposed to providing value to a family or the entire community. Now, that is born of those who were developing this product just like did not have the context of those who are going to be using it. They actually did not have the same beliefs or the same mindsets or mental models about how ownership takes place or how things should work within a community. So there are two things to kind of like acknowledge, when we think about this tension. There's a gap between what we want to happen, vision, mission, values. This is for you personally, but also, maybe for your company or organization that you're working for. And then underneath here is the current reality, what we have. And between that is this space of creative tension. And I think in order to kind of achieve what we want at the top, we need to address this creative tension. And I think the systems thinking mindset is something that I've found to be really effective in terms of just connecting these two things and making this space explicit. So thinking about systems forces us to consider beyond the direct benefit of use. This means going beyond individual users, their context, their use of products and services. And so we can think about, how do we kind of broaden our lens? First, we can think about what a system is. A system is more than a sum of its parts. It may exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and sometimes evolutionary behavior. This definition is from Donella Meadows, who wrote Thinking in Systems. It is, I believe, a real foundational text in systems thinking if you're thinking about adopting this. So she basically describes it as an interconnected set of elements, coherently organized in a way that achieves something. So, some examples or metaphors might be the human body, right? Like you have lots of different organs, they are doing a lot of different things, but, ultimately they are trying to achieve, keeping you alive, I guess, like keep you walking around. And another example is also just like natural systems like forests, right? There's like interdependencies between species, which is why biodiversity is so important. So a way to think about systems in the context of your work is in the form of three concepts that apply to it. So first, there's interconnectedness. So how are things connected to each other in ways beyond, whatever your primary purview is? Then there's causality. Not just like what happens when somebody is like using the thing you're designing, but what happens next, and then what happens next, and how does it kind of like radiate out, and then again connect to kind of like basically connect the first two concepts. And then last is wholeness. So think about the system as a whole and how that extends beyond, I guess, like again, your individual purview. So in order to do that, it means trying to think in a more expansive way. So there's a certain mindset that you can adopt when you think about engaging in systems thinking. So in the 70s, the philosopher Karl Popper talked about two types of problems. He described them as clock problems and cloud problems. So clock problems have clear elements that work together. They can be broken down into parts. If a clock breaks, you can take it apart and kind of isolate the problem and fix it and then put it back together and make it work again. And this is how a lot of engineering happens, is just like thinking about how things fit together, and it's very directional. You're basically trying to get a clock to work. So, if you think about designing for digital products, that's how we kind of like address, the process is just like thinking about componentizing things. Sorry, having trouble speaking today. And then just like figuring out how they work together in order to make something that eventually works. On the other side are cloud problems. So clouds are literally nebulous. They are clouds, and they move and they're dynamic. They are complex systems with many aspects that affect each other. They're systems that adapt and change. And I think the thing is, designers often work with engineers. They also work within engineering cultures. And we take the same reductionist view that the things we're working on are clocks. But with increased scale and complexity and interdependency, we need to kind of think about, we need to live in the clouds, basically. So from my view, there are kind of three things we need to keep in mind in order to kind of take on that mindset that the things that we are dealing with are actually cloud problems and not clock problems. So the first is make the invisible visible. Like, it's our job to start trying to see systems. Oftentimes they exist in your day-to-day life and we just don't recognize it. So I'm gonna use like kind of an example from urban settings. There was a great story a couple years ago in National Geographic that focused on the unequal distribution of trees in some cities. So for example, in LA, you can have an area on the left that has almost no trees. And then in other areas, you have lots of trees. And these two images are actually on the same street, several kilometers away from each other. When there are heat waves, trees in neighborhoods can cool surface temperatures by up to 25 degrees Celsius. So one thing to keep in mind is that these two neighborhoods have very different demographics. So the one on the left, which is in Koreatown, it's an area made up of mostly Latino residents and Asian residents. And the one on the right, which is in Los Feliz, is mostly made up of white residents. And areas with fewer trees also have lower property values. Trees contribute to higher property value. And then, as I mentioned before, when you have things like a deadly heat wave, it can literally be life or death, like living in that neighborhood or living in the neighborhood on the right. So these disparate paths are initially formed by discriminatory attitudes and beliefs. And then what you have is that these discriminatory attitudes and beliefs are then codified and solidified into structures and policy that reinforce them. And then you can see the consequences can take on many different forms. And this is all visible just by noticing that there are trees in some places and not others. Oops. Okay. So all of these things are interconnected, and a framework that I use a lot in order to kind of like get at those things, like within my work, is the STEEP framework. So there's 5 elements to it. There's thinking about things from a sociocultural perspective, thinking about things from a technological perspective, environmental, economic, and political. Anything you work on has some aspect of these 5 things. And you can automatically start kind of expanding your mindset about what you're working on by considering these things, not just like the technology and how it works, not just like the direct experience of things, but what is the sociocultural impact? You see a lot, for example, we're now working on products, some of which have like billions of users. If you're working, for example, on products by like the major 5 technology companies. And so there's lots of sociocultural dynamic that might not be acknowledged in the making of those products. Along with everything else, like the environmental impact. Like the environmental impact, I just read a story recently about like the environmental impact of large language learning models. Like that doesn't even seem like it's at the top of the list of our discussions about AI, but that's an aspect that should be considered, and you can kind of like widen how you think about things by using systems thinking. So a framework that I shared yesterday in the workshop is the iceberg model, which I really like for kind of like breaking down root cause. And yeah, there's like some similarities to what Ben shared earlier with the pyramid, where there's like that layer of things that you see, and then underneath that are things like beliefs, there's mindsets, and there's structure. So again, if we think about the example with the trees, there are these mental models. There's literally racial discrimination and white supremacy that have kind of driven those decisions. And then those become structure. So those become the things that reinforce those beliefs. And then you kind of see at the very top, there's fewer trees in some neighborhoods than others. And you can do this exercise to basically understand the existing context and decision-making to whatever it is you're working on and how it's impacted by other things. So the second thing to keep in mind as you're adopting a systems thinking mindset is remember that today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. So outcomes of change can both be intended and unintended. So I'll talk about incentives and unintended consequences for a minute through an example. In 1902, French colonial Hanoi had a rat problem. There was, this was due to the colonist government. They were trying to modernize and add like civilization to this tropical place by building houses for the French colonial residents that had toilets in them. What the toilets required were miles and miles of sewer systems for this very small percentage of the population. And within the sewer system, pretty quickly, they just became like rat heaven, like rats just populated them, and it was just like, yeah, it was ideal for them to live in. And so the colonizers thought of like a really good plan to eradicate the rat problem. They had Vietnamese locals catch rats and turn in the rat's tail for a bounty. And so they were paying them to like kill the rats and turn in the tail. What happened instead is like before you knew it, there were like millions and millions of rats running around without tails because they're just like cutting off the tails and turning it in. And not only that, but there was rat farming that was happening in order to be able to increase the number of rats and the amount of money you could make by turning in rat tails. And they kept doubling down on this idea until, it finally, like, I don't know. I like to imagine it was just like all of the government officials were overwhelmed by rats, basically. I think some of them actually ended up leaving. So this is what we call a perverse incentive. It's an incentive that actually thwarts what you are trying to achieve. And the reasons for that can be really complex. Again, it's kind of like going back to that steep framework. There was sociocultural misunderstandings between the French colonial government and the locals. There's a huge power differential between those who were governing and those who were living there. That government was infamously brutal and oppressive. And so in a way, you can kind of think of it as the locals were kind of sticking it to the man, right? They're like, yeah, you want us to get rid of your rat problem? I mean, you guys are the only ones like building for yourselves and whatnot. We're just gonna like make sure that we get what we can get out of this. And that's what happens when you have these like huge power differentials. If you want to see that as a causal loop, it looks something like this. So causal loop diagramming is something that systems thinkers do a lot of, and that they're always like really good reminders, again, that yesterday's solutions become today's problems. So you have here the rat population increasing, there's a bounty per rat that's applied, rat farming happens, and then the rat population increases. So probably like one of the simplest vicious cycles that you could represent, but you can try doing this for like various things when you see sort of those unintended consequences happening. This can apply to many of the things we're working on. So if you're working on digital technology products and services, there's lots of potential unintended consequences. There's automation and job displacement. There's misinformation spread. There's issues of privacy and data security, genetic engineering and bioethics. I just found out that that one scientist who made like CRISPR babies, like we can't have CRISPR babies now, but he like went ahead and did it before anybody said he couldn't. Environmental impact of clean technologies. So literally what happens like when we're trying to dispose of batteries for things like electric vehicles, right? And then algorithmic bias, which kind of like permeates everything that we do in digital technology. And by the way, this was how ChatGPT answered this question for me. So I was actually pretty impressed that it came up with like such diverse categories. Also, I like how I was like, what could ChatGPT look like? And it looks like Eve from WALL-E. And I think there's a lot of parallels actually, because like, wasn't she like kind of programmed to do something just like some kind of like minor thing? So I guess like she's kind of cute, but what's the other one? GPT-4. I think of that one as more of like a one of those Boston robotics dogs, I think, because it's just like, it actually really scares me. It like passed the like bar exam with like 99% within the 99th percentile or something. Anyway, you can be scared, but also it's really interesting because I think there are some benefits to what we are doing, and oftentimes we have a form of techno-optimism that prevents us from thinking about these things, right? That prevents us from thinking about these unintended consequences, and oftentimes your leadership just doesn't want to even go there. Like I've worked with many a technology organization where I try to have these conversations, and I actually created a toolkit, which is called the Tarot Cards of Tech, and it's meant to like disguise these hard conversations about things like this in this like cute little game that we can play with, I don't know, technology executives and things like that. Because usually they wouldn't want to have these conversations. They're like, oh wow, you're real like buzzkill. Like all you do is talk about Black Mirror and stuff like that. But it's like, yeah, you should be talking about that and figuring out like you don't want to be a headline, right? So, but it's really hard to kind of get past that mindset that whatever we're doing is absolutely the right thing. So basically thinking about the way that we're solving problems leads to other problems is a good way of keeping our collective arrogance in check. And you can do sorts of analysis like using lots of causal loops. You might just do one causal loop, and that might kind of raise some ideas or questions or opportunities about how to solve for this. The last sort of principle or the thing that I think about if you're adopting a systems thinking mindset is to diversify and empower your stakeholders. So yesterday in the workshop, I was like, the icebreaker I gave was like guilty pleasure and irrational hate. And I was just thinking this morning about how like one of my guilty pleasures is reading just like celebrity biographies because they can just be like kind of bad. So I just been like, I was just reading Prince Harry's celebrity biography, and it's actually pretty good because his ghostwriter is really good. And I read an article by his ghostwriter, and his ghostwriter said something like, and I'm gonna paraphrase, he said, the thin gruel of empathy is nothing compared to the marrow of experience. And I was like, oh, wow, he's actually describing like co-design. He's actually describing participatory design. So one of the things that designers really need to kind of think about is designer positionality. Like, what is your position? What kind of powers and biases do you bring to the table? You are not agnostic to the system, right? You have a certain power in being able to design things, to like change things. And this starts with knowing what your powers and biases are. One of my friends who's like a systems thinking practitioner says, yeah, the practitioners are in the system, not outside of it. You're not a neutral observer. I worked with a design researcher once who I was kind of like, how do you work in, you know, like I do a lot of work in education, and so that's where a lot of my subject domain expertise lies. I was like, oh, you've never done education project before? Yeah, how are you doing this? And he was like, oh, I'm just like agnostic. I'm like somebody who just like parachutes in, and because I'm a designer, I can like interpret everything and then just design for whoever. I'm like, yeah, this is why, you know, some global development philanthropies that I work with literally have like warehouses full of like failed interventions, you know, not unlike one laptop per child, because there's no kind of like understanding of their positionality. They come from like a Western mindset. They have advanced education. They're probably white or work in a white dominant environment. Like, you need to acknowledge all of these things because oftentimes we're being tasked with designing for people who do not fall into those categories. So it's important to bring in and diversify perspectives in your work. Mike Jackson, who wrote in the 70s towards a system of system methodologies, he was a systems thinking scientist, said, if possible, all the stakeholders should participate in various phases of the process. Stakeholders here include representatives of purposeful parts of the system and the larger system. So this means engaging stakeholders like lived experts in designing for the future. So he also says, the idealized future is a statement of the system the planners and stakeholders would create if they were free to create any system they wanted. If pursued positively, this can lead to the interests of different, you know, parts of the organization, outside of the organization itself, and wider society. So, you know, think about like the lived expertise people that you are designing for, but not just the people you're designing for, but people who might be affected by what you're designing, but have very little power in the system. So an example of that from my work is my team developed a personas toolkit for BIPOC post-secondary students. So we were working with, what we call in the US minority serving institutions. So students that are comprised of mostly Black and Latino students and students experiencing poverty. And I don't know, how many of you, I actually have a little bit of a bone to pick with personas. How many of you have either developed personas or have been handed a persona and you're like, this is not it? Yeah, hands are going. I didn't even expect for you to raise hands, but yes, yes, that's usually the case. And so what we did was just basically participatory design rather than, we were asked by this organization we were working with to design personas, and we're like, you know what, I hate personas. Am I gonna have to give this reason why I hate personas and pitch it to them as something else? So what we did was create components of, what we just kind of kept calling a personas toolkit, even though it's kind of just a context toolkit of what students were experiencing, especially marginalized students, as they were going through their college experience. And this meant engaging, in our practice, we don't call them research participants, we call them lived experts, because especially when we're trying to do the work of disrupting power imbalances between those who are making decisions and those who have very little decision-making power. So we conducted foundational research with students, but then we also had them engage in systems thinking exercises. So this is creating an ecosystem of who your supports are. And what does that look like? And also had people who better understood the overarching system, like academic researchers, do this work as well. And this allowed them to imagine the future, how this tool will be used, and what kinds of futures it could inform. So keeping in mind the idea of expanding your idea of stakeholders and involving them in the process, we can return to our design thinking framework with 5 steps. But for systems thinking, I want to expand this notion a little bit. So I've added a couple of steps. So you see the design thinking process, which is the third circle. So you would first expand. Expand means thinking about the process of, what is your notion of the system outside of your area of concern. So this could include mapping the status quo, doing things like creating iceberg diagrams, as well as, again, co-designing with those who are within the system. You're not going off and doing this sort of thing yourself. Then you imagine the possibilities. So are there different levels at which the interventions can occur? And the reason I call, kind of what we would think of as design solutions interventions is because of that Peter Senge quote where it's today's problems are yesterday's solutions. So I think of them as approaches, interventions, leverage points, because you're really kind of thinking, you're resetting your mindset about how the things you do kind of feed back into the system. And then you can go into the design process, and last is evaluate. So determine the impact of the change in the system, not just by measuring it, but by being cognizant of the consequences. And one thing to remember is that there's no single solution that's going to solve for this. So in this case, there might be 4 different things that go through the design process. And then outside of that, there could be solutions that lie in the form of policy or lie in the form of different business models. You can totally imagine beyond just your purview of what a designed thing is. And so this concept is related to the idea of multifinality. And multifinality is a systems thinking concept where nothing can be solved with just one thing. There's many different ways of solving a problem. So to sum up, kind of the 3 principles of adopting systems thinking mindset is to make the invisible visible, remember that today's problems come from yesterday's solution, and diversify and empower your stakeholders, make them part of the process, and kind of disrupt the power imbalances within your own process and structure. I have to talk a little bit about what got me into systems thinking to begin with. I run an equity-centered design practice focused on education and impact. What that means is that my practice is really focused on the kids who have the least amount of opportunities within the education system. oftentimes these are kids who are racially discriminated against. They suffer poverty, they suffer displacement, they come from refugee families, those who are essentially marginalized right now. And so what systems thinking helps me do in my practice is to question the framing, to be able to question the status quo and not just take it for granted. It also intersects with the future of education, and it's a reminder that the future of education is informed by the past of education. And the past of education has been informed by racism, misogyny, colonization. I have a little bit of a anecdote in my book where like my name literally comes from like resistance to colonization. And so this is something that I think about in terms of like my own positionality. And it's a reminder too that things that exist that are, you know, we feel like are unfair or unequal, or if we want to create greater equity, those things can be disrupted. And we can start by understanding context at the systemic level. Some of you are familiar with this quote from William Gibson, but the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And so that's something I think about almost every day in my work. Like we're always thinking about new technologies and how they're going to exist. And it's, you know, we're not really necessarily thinking about who is in charge, who is using them, who is developing these things, and how is that informing what happens to everybody else who's not in control. So Dr. Bettina Love, who writes a lot about educational freedom, has this concept that I really love in my work called freedom dreaming. So it's a dreaming about a system that is free from today's oppression. And I think that's what we need to do when we adopt a systems thinking mindset, is kind of like dream about and move the needle when it comes to systemic change. And so I think there are things that you care about, and I'm sure there are things that you feel like you might be trading off in your work, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You can try to kind of think beyond what you are in control of and start activating how to connect your values with what you want to happen from a societal impact perspective. And so, you know, I kind of leave you with this. How do you see yourself using systems thinking? I hope you can find ways to adopt it. Please get in contact with me if there's like interesting ways that you kind of adopt potential like systems thinking frameworks to make change in your organization or in your work or in your product. And yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.